I'm on now. Right. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee. We have apologies for absence from Councillor Inskip, and Caroline Shepherd is substituting. We also have apologies for the Chief Executive. He's at a, sounds awfully frightening, regional rail summit. But it is his intention to join us at our meetings whenever diaries allow. So it's not a. I had a chat with him, and he's up in a. Not only is it the sit for guidance, but it's his wish to attend, but not today, unfortunately. Members have to declare they have any pecuniary interests in conflict for today. All well, okay. I've just got a couple of announcements then. Some of us were able to attend the members' induction session, which the Combined Authority held at the University of Peterborough. It was, and slides have been circulated. It was the most informative experience in all my years of being chair, and we know that one of our challenges is that we're outside the business, so getting the texture and understanding the nature of the organisation. There is the intention to hold future sessions, so those who are unable to make it, I would encourage you to try and squeeze a space in your diary when the next thing's announced. So it was a great success, I thought. Did you want to add anything? No. You will also note that on the agenda, there's an item has been placed at the end for the opportunity to discuss in private session. Would members like that opportunity, or are they happy just to note the paper? Are we happy to note? Okay, so thank you very much. So that deals with that item at the end. Excellent. I'd now like to move on to item 3, which are the meeting of it's the minutes of our previous meeting. It was only a month or so ago. It just seems a bit deja vu today. Are we happy with the minutes as a record of the previous meeting? Yes. Yeah, okay. So we'll take those as accepted. If we could just go down to the action log, which I'm hunting for. I notice there are a number of items we need to have a look at. One item I know Nick Bell wants to talk to us about, so maybe you could do that one, which is financial resilience, whilst I find the right page.
Yes, thank you. It's an item that came up, I think, dating back now to the January Audit and Governance meeting, was one around ensuring that the finance team here at the Combined Authority had sufficient resilience to be able to cope with potential issues of sickness, or potential leavers. And I think this came about in terms of last year, the production of the statement of accounts being significantly delayed because of some absences. So I've been working over the course of the last few months with Rob Emery, who's the Assistant Director for Finance, within the Combined Authority, to ensure that we've now got sufficient resilience in place. What we now have is that we've checked and we have sufficient financial resources and budget to ensure the coverage. We are putting together and have plans to appoint a new project accountant, a systems accountant. They are currently being covered by interim resources, but the intent is to go out immediately after the summer when the market is better for recruitment in September to see if we can recruit those two permanently. We've also done some further work in terms of making sure that the workload is better spread across the finance team. So again, there is less of an opportunity in terms of a single point of failure should one individual be away for a period of time, and also making sure that we have the right notes in place, etc., so that people can refer refer to those if required, and we need to bring in short-term interim support. So we think the combination of all of that significantly reduces the risk of other problems with financial resilience from the finance team in the future. However, very happy to take any further questions from the committee in relation to that point.
We'll get used to this microphone. I found my bit of paper. It's page 14 of 299. It's the action log. If I just skim, go through a few. 5.3, which is about the tracking of internal audit recommendations, I think we can close as it's on the agenda. At item that was 8 point.
I need to connect to the Wi-Fi. I'm really sorry. So I can see they're here like everybody else, but can I have a temporary Wi-Fi pass? Sorry. Should I not connect?
Should be able to connect.
Well, but
The temperature.
Yeah.
Issued.
yeah, it should connect automatically, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Oh,
I need to.
register.
How do I get to my connections?
That's it. No,
No, that's not
the
it.
round one.
That
Next
one.
one.
I can't see.
So if you just click
This one.
yeah, connect. Yeah. Oh, okay. Go back. Cancel if you cancel that.
I'll move on whilst. Okay, whilst that's being done, if we could just at item 18, 8.4, which is the bottom of page 15, it starts. We've got an audit of audit and governance committees across the combined authorities. This is to try and give us some insight and learning about stability and whatever. Do we have a sort of aiming point for that, Nick?
We do, Chair. The aim for that is to bring back a report to the September meeting of this committee. But we've started work already to identify practice elsewhere in other audit and governance committees of male combined authorities, and that should be ready for consideration by this committee. I think it's the 8th of September when you meet again.
Thank you. Moving up down the page, we've got 14.4, which can be closed because that's a duplicate. 17.3, we now have a date for the cyber security development session, which you should have all received, I hope. I can't remember what the date is, but we have one. And you will have noted that we put 2 more development sessions in your diaries, topics to be thought as they emerge. Okay. So I think that's all I had from the action log. Did anybody have anything else? Thank you. Okay, so we now move on to, thank you, item 4, which is the improvement framework, which Angela will come and introduce for us. We've got our tasks this morning, remembering we met not long ago, is to note the progress since June in reaction to the external auditor's letter and the best value notice, to note the outcomes of the recent staff survey, and to note the confirmation of the chair of the Independent Improvement Board. So with that introduction, Angela, may I give the floor to you?
Yes, thank you, Chair. First of all, Chair, with your permission, I'd just like to acknowledge the untimely death of Lord Kerslake. In the short time that Lord Kerslake was the chair of the Independent Improvement Board, he really demonstrated and understood the role that an improvement board um, should play and how it added most value in supporting the combined authority on its improvement journey, using his vast experience and understanding of what it takes an organisation to address areas of concern. He was a real true friend of the CA and advocated for us with our stakeholders. But he was also a very honourable man, and I believe exhibited in the short time that he was chair the values that we in the CA are embedding about being collegiate, having integrity, really striving for the vision that he believed the CA should have about different ways of the improvement board operating and also the leadership he gave. So, Chair, he worked with us for a short time, but made a huge impact, I believe, on the approach that we have taken and indeed the progress that we have made.
Thank you, Angela.
The red circle needs to be slightly larger so you can see it sitting behind. But Chair, you have already shared with the committee that this meeting is sort of ahead of the cycle of reporting on the formal update on progress for the improvement plan. So this report gives some key areas of highlight, just as an opportunity to have an overview of the elements that have been delivered in June. The formal highlight report, using the RAG rating that we looked at last time, has been signed off this week by CMT colleagues, and it will go to the IIB on the 17th of July and then the CA board on the 26th of July. And Chair, I will circulate that report in advance of the next audit and governance meeting when it's uploaded to go to the CA board, so members can have a full sense of the progress that has been made. So today is a brief update, and hopefully that you will bear with me. In paragraph 2.3, Chair, it sets out the progress against each of the highlight of the progress against each of the themes. And Chair, I will just pull out a few elements of that. In terms of governance, induction sessions have been held, Chair, as you've identified. The revised scrutiny function has been agreed by Overview and Scrutiny, which is a real step forward. And member training is in place, underway, and being developed. In terms of project delivery, we've made good progress and engagement with DULUC regarding the clearance process that we need to have in place for the single assurance framework that is being put in place, and working well with our constituent authority members and officers on that. In terms of procurement, members heard at the last meeting the PwC report. Those recommendations have been accepted, and a detailed action plan is now in place to address these. In terms of partnerships, a review of existing priority partnerships is due to commence this week, and there is a lot of activity. And as the chair has shared, the chief executive term, a rail network, the partnership working that the CA officers and members are now involved in, is now quite extensive and building on what the approach that we want to take with regards to partnerships. In terms of culture, confidence and capacity, the third staff conference has taken place. The third staff survey has been undertaken, and I've brought back today an update on that, given the interest last time by committee members. The CA board member induction session has taken place, and we are building our capacity in terms of engagement and communication. But Chair, as I've shared, the full report with the RAG ratings will be circulated when it is uploaded for the CA board. Chair, moving on to the staff survey, we shared in March the feedback from key stakeholders that had been gathered through CMT discussions with constituent management teams in terms of perceptions of change. And I believe the recent staff survey, the third staff survey, also gives us a view of progress that is being made in the activity that is taking place. The headline feedback is identified in this report. And Chair, I won't go through that in detail, other than to share that paragraph 2.4 sets out the key areas of that the questions focused on. The questions are set out in the appendix, and they are consistent with the staff surveys undertaken in September and again in January. So we're building a picture of progress. As set out in 2.6, paragraph 2.6, responses have been, on the whole, positive, which is good, other than one question about does your job give you the flexibility to meet your personal needs? And I'll come back to that. What I would say on that is that CMT are mindful of the workload of staff. It has come through the survey and are reviewing workload and priorities to ensure that there is a better balance in place, alongside ensuring, as Nick Bell has already shared this morning, ensuring that there is available resource to focus on our key priority areas. I believe, Chair, as set out in paragraph 2.7, these are encouraging messages that staff are sharing with us that demonstrate the change, a positive change in culture and leadership. An action plan that was done in the previous survey is being put in place to address the areas that need further attention, so that we can go back to staff to say, you've shared with us, we've listened, and we have changed or put in place. Lastly, Chair, in 2.8, we set out that Richard Carr has been appointed as the Independent Improvement Board Chair. He will meet with yourself as Chair following over the next few months, and we are arranging those meetings. And he is to chair the Improvement Board on the 17th of July, and the papers for that board will go out on Monday next week. So, Chair, that is brief. I'm happy to take questions, but as I said at the beginning, this is an interim update, and a much fuller update will be shared at the next committee.
Thank you, Angela. I wonder, Mark, if the external audit perspective, if anything you'd like to say before we have discussion. Thank you very much. Okay, open to the floor.
Quite all right, not a problem. Thank you, Chair. Andrew, thank you for the report. And I think the thing that sprung out at me immediately under 2.8 is the concern about elected members and their integrity. And I thought that's a fairly meaty governance issue, if there ever was one. I just wondered if you could give some more detail on what the survey showed from staff, and perhaps we should reflect on it as members about what came from that. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, that is a comment that has been shared rather than that is the start of a conversation with staff. So it's a comment that has been raised. In the spirit of openness, we have shared that, and we'll share that with other elected members. in terms of what do we need to do about that, we need to share and speak with both yourselves and other CA members in terms of the values that have been agreed that are for not only officers but also staff. Officers, but also members. We need to understand more from talking to groups of staff, and there will be some focus groups with staff to look at all the messages that have come out of the staff survey to understand and unpick some of these comments that have been made, and then address those by the discussions with board members and potentially with yourselves. But Chair, I would reiterate the values that have been put in place are for both officers and members, and the development for members will look at those and put those in place.
Nick?
Thank you. I could just echo those comments from Angela, and also just note that actually we have the member officer protocol report later on the agenda today as well, and obviously that's a critical point in relation to this, as is Angela's alluded to the fact that the values are there for both officers and for members, and indeed we have some additional resources that have been provided to us by the LGA to work with board and member development, and that's something that we would look to be using during the course of this year as well to ensure they're in place. So other than that, just wanted to make members of the committee aware of those two issues. Thank you.
Andy has raised exactly the question I was going to raise. Just to clarify, Angela, you said this was a comment that came. Was that from an individual then, rather than a general comment? Because the way I read this was a number of people had expressed concern about the integrity of elected members. But if you're saying it's one, maybe we don't need to worry quite so much. I was extremely pleased with the generally positive response, and that you're going to develop an action plan to deal with the activities which were going to be picked up. I think at some stage, JP, it would be useful if that came back to us so that we can see how it's all delivered in time. But otherwise, it seems extremely positive. But I would like to put Mark on the spot at some stage as to whether or not he thinks we're going in the right direction here. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham.
Yes, there are 2 points actually. The first one is to echo the comments around the member integrity. So glad to see that that is being looked at and being taken forward in there. The other point that I had on here was around on 2.3 under procurement, about training on procurement and contract management for all staff, which is really good to see that. I just wanted to ask, is that going to sort of form part of mandatory training for all staff, and how is it being tracked, and will it be sort of refreshed and reminders sent out to people as well?
I think Nick would like to answer that.
Thank you, Councillor Christie. Yes, of course, there's more detail on procurement actually on today's agenda as well. And if you recall from the action plan that we brought last time to the committee, there were 4 key actions on there, one of which was about making sure that all staff have procurement training and contract management training in place. We're currently working to specify who's best to deliver that across the organisation, and we hope to start rolling that out subject to final board approval. It's going to the Combined Authority Board on the 26th of July. Hope to start rolling it out early in the autumn, and it will be mandatory for all staff to have undertaken some form of procurement and contract management training, but of course there will be some specific requirements as well for those who are more involved in the detailed technical aspect as well.
Colleague trying to put you on the spot. Are you on the spot?
He always does. I think it's fair to say that we continue to be encouraged by the actions that we're seeing being taken in response to our letter. And it's good to see that management team is at full capacity. And I met Rob virtually on Monday this week for the introductions. And clearly the way the improvement board continues to roll out its response to the action plans over the coming months will be key to our overall conclusion.
Thank you. You won't get closer to Delphi. Good. I think that's very helpful, and we look forward in the autumn to, because bearing in mind this is only 4 weeks since we last discussed this subject, to a fuller update. I think the point about behaviours, you know, I mean, I was pleased. Having said that, I can't remember. Is it civil? I think that was your acronym for the behaviours, which I thought was very useful to put into that. It'd be interesting to get insight on how you're using that. In a previous life with a similar approach, we melded it into the appraisal system, the way things were done within the business, and kept it. It was useful objectively to say this wasn't, in this case, civil. But so I'd be interested, and I'm sure members would welcome a little insight into how you're doing that at the next meeting, or even now if Nick's got the answer.
Happy to bring back a more detailed report to the next meeting, but just to give you a broad brush in relation to that, we have worked across the organisation and with partners actually now as well to develop a series of positive behaviours that help to reinforce those 5 values of collaboration, innovation, vision, integrity and leadership. And we're also ensuring now that we focus that on both our appraisal system, so picking up in terms of performance appraisal and objective setting, and also through the recruitment process as well, in terms of actually how we structure questions to really understand whether or not an individual already has those values and how those values they can demonstrate a link to the ones that we're doing. So quite a lot of work already in relation to that, Chair, but again, happy to bring a more detailed report to the next meeting.
Thank you very much, Nick. So,
Yes.
you've
So
been unusually sitting on your hand.
is it okay? Yeah, this is quite concerning because it was conduct and behaviours which was played quite a contributory part to the place that we're in at the moment. And it's concerning that staff feel that members are not conducting themselves in the way in which has been agreed. And I think that we need to know a bit more about why that's still happening and what kind of socialization's going on here, because I've witnessed members being very abrupt and brusque, not in this committee, but in another committee. And it was passed, no one made a comment on it. No one spoke to the member at that point that this was unacceptable way to address an officer who, of course, do not have the right to reply. So it doesn't seem we've quite got it right yet. And I think it's incumbent on every single one of us to call out any kind of bad behaviour that they witness by a fellow member of this authority.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think that's absolutely right in what you said. Perhaps we could come back to that issue later in the agenda when we look at the member officers protocol. But it always seems to me, it's the speaking out when it happens or shortly thereafter if it's something that should be done privately is the need, but it's also the hardest thing for human beings to do because we don't actually. It's the softer approach is to well, that was probably not as bad as I thought it was. But so yes, I think we should always be encouraging in all our networks that when behaviour is inappropriate, that we do something about it, either then or with the relevant contacts. But on that note, I close this item. If we're content. Thank you very much, Angela. We're now going to do is what we bumped off the agenda at our last meeting, and we're going to have a look at the corporate risk register and the progress that's being made. So Chris Belton will introduce the papers. We're asked to note the refreshed corporate risk register, to note the procurement and implementation of corporate risk software, and to note that a risk appetite session has been undertaken with the corporate management team and a risk appetite statement drafted. And you have with you on Zoom, Adam, do we? Adam Liquid? What is my name?
Yes, Adam Licorice.
So if you've got,
Good morning, Chair.
if Chris has got, well, there are questions which Chris can't answer. He's got reinforcements online. Okay.
We
Chris.
certainly have.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you again. So this is a delayed paper from last month. We're quite proud of the work that we've been doing with risk. The committee's always been sort of kept up to speed with it. With regards to this paper, we want to tell you about that progress. So just to sort of take you back 9 months, when the programme office sort of took on the responsibility of the corporate risk register, it wasn't in great shape. There was big gaping holes in the middle of some of the risk register, particularly around mitigation scorings. Some of the risks that were on there were quite old, even going back to the old mayor, the previous mayor. So we've worked hard. One, getting the corporate risk register in a decent state. Equally, we wanted, on the advice of the committee and direction of the committee, we wanted to tidy it up. It can be quite a big document. It's quite difficult to have a look at some of the risks and the mitigations and the scores, particularly when there's an awful lot of work going on across the organisation. So we've asked RSM and Adam to come in to tidy up that risk register. So we'd like to look at that with you this morning. We'll also have a risk dashboard and go into a bit more detail on a heat map as well. So it will give you an idea of where the risks sit on the heat map. On top of that, we just want you to note the implementation of the risk software. What we really want to do is make it easier for people to be reporting risk right across the organisation. So we're looking not only at the corporate level to be looking at risks, also down to a service level as well. So we dig a bit deeper. And also just to update the committee that we have undertaken the risk appetite session. We do have the risk appetite statement in draft, but we're waiting for CMT to get a slot on CMT to be able to sign it off. So apologies for not being able to share that with you before today. So just some background. Members will be aware that we've run a couple of risk management sessions now, one back in November, one more recently in March. We've rolled out risk management training for all combined authority and subsidiary company program and project managers. That was back in February. And as I mentioned, we've done the risk appetite session with CMT at the end of April. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what we really want to do is to make sure that you have the best information to be assured that we're dealing with risks correctly, that there's owners associated with the risks are controlled with the mitigations. Equally, we want to make sure that you have the information about the trends with the risks. So are they going up? Are they staying the same? Are they going down? And you see in your papers there's some of the trends with regards to net zero, particularly cybersecurity as well, and EQIA risk there sort of trending up. We've got Adam Goldsmith on the line as well to talk about cybersecurity, which I think would be helpful for the committee given the importance of that risk. I suppose just to finish before I hand over to Adam to sort of talk you through the documents, we just want to make sure that there's real visibility of risk across the organisation. I think we're at a place where we've improved, as I mentioned, from 9 months ago. We've got plans to improve even more, but we really need to embed this risk. Going back to Chair's earlier point, not last meeting before, it's about embedding that risk. So there's a risk culture, so people understand the risk is a good thing. It's good to be able to be checking this, to put the mitigations in place, to allow, and it gives the work programme a better, a solid background, because you have confidence that your officers, the officers, and the organisations that we commission to do the work, are really looking at what they need to deliver, and equally putting in plans in case something goes wrong. It doesn't always go wrong. We know it has happened in the past here. And I suppose, just to finish off before I hand over to Adam, I'm pleased how seriously it's taken now, but there's still work to do.
Chris, good morning, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully, yep, John, you can hear me. Great. So, yeah, I mean, really, obviously, this is still part of the journey. There are some developments still in train. What you've got in front of you in the appendices is kind of, I guess, the first iteration of reporting to take that step away from that rather significantly large spreadsheet, which is in the appendices for information purposes, just so you can see the difference and how the information's changing, not just from a risk management perspective, but also in the way that it's reported and that you see it. So what I'd like to do is just talk you through some of those appendices. Appendix 1 is the corporate risk register. And this is filtered on proximity. So each risk has a proximity aligned to it, and that's essentially, where is it on the horizon? Is it imminent, close, or slightly longer tail? And this has some of the more detailed information in there in terms of the risk scores, the controls, and then some action detail. So you can see we've got some names in the frame from a responsibility point of view, and a target date in which we're aiming to have those implemented by, with a view to hitting that target priority on the right hand side. So this is, like I say, there's a fair bit of detail in there, but hopefully it tells a logical story in the sense of what the risk is, the exposure, how it's being managed by the authority, and then what more we're doing to improve the position. And you'll also see in there is a direction of travel column, which equals, it means it hasn't moved since the last meeting. I guess given their nature, that was only I guess this paper's been in for a week, so it was only 3 weeks prior to being done last time. So you may not necessarily see a whole lot of movement in that period. But again, this is more of a reference point. So if you want to see some of the detail, you can. Moving on to Appendix 3, which is the Appendix 2, apologies, the dashboard. So within the tool, within the platform that for risk, there is a number of different dashboards. What we've done here is just to start to pull out some of that information which we feel is valuable to the committee. So you can see we've cut the corporate risk register looking at different aspects. So the first, risks by category, different scoring profiles. And then I mentioned that proximity element. So on the bottom row of those 7 charts, you can see, for example, within the imminent, there are a number of very high risks, which may be a point of focus. But again, the close and the approaching, it's good to just have that kind of profile in terms of where it is on the horizon. And then looking at the kind of overdue actions, again, from a reporting timetable point of view, some of those might have just gone over, as I think they were the end of June. So again, we'd need a bit of an update on those. Some of those may well have been closed off. And they will be updated each time. We may tweak with what you see as we start to populate the system more. Obviously, we've started with the corporate risk register. As we move into the directorates and the services, we might start to look at perhaps some of those higher risks that we want to bring to your attention from an escalation point of view, or maybe where there's some actions that are long overdue. Again, it'd be important for you to have visibility of that. And as Chris has put in the paper, one of the good things about the system here is that we've got that ability to do this at a press of a button. So it saves the time of having to really kind of go through a raft of spreadsheets to get this analysis. Moving on to the next appendix, you've got the heat map. So this is what we're looking at here is the whole corporate risk profile plotted by impact and likelihood. The position of the circle represents its residual position, so the current state of play. The color of the circle dictates where it has come from inherently. So inherently is obviously without the control environment. And it just allows you to kind of focus and pick out which ones you may choose to consider more deeply and make sure that there's the correct level of management in there. And then moving on to, I won't talk through the original format corporate risk register. I believe the committee is probably fairly familiar with that, and obviously that's what we're trying to move away from. So the last appendix there is the movement by time. Now, as we build up the data each month and these risk scores are reviewed and updated, obviously this position will change. So the light blue circle represents the current score, i.e. where we are at this point in time. And the darker circle represents where it has moved from. So just for clarity purposes, there has been some, as we go through this implementation, the data is building up. So the three at the bottom that have a dark circle weren't scored 4 weeks ago. So they haven't escalated hugely. Just there was no data in the system. So therefore it represents a movement. So not necessarily to be unduly concerned by that escalation in risk score. That's purely a data piece. But the movement between the two represents how it's moved over time. So we've run this report over the last 4 weeks in time for the papers for this. And as you can see, the vast majority of those risks are still in the current position, which is not necessarily a surprise at this point in time. So they're the different styles of reporting. There are others, and we're still working through that as we develop the risk register and some of the mechanics within there. Over the summer, we're going to be putting in some more time to work with Chris and the PMO to roll this out further across the organisation, to build up that kind of risk management culture, awareness, and capability, so that hopefully by the time we get to the September meeting on the 8th, we'll be able to provide you with an update on where we are with that implementation, and give you a position. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Adam and Chris. Members open for discussion. Oh, sorry, Nick, on my left, Nick wants to say something.
Thank you. If I could just first of all say a big thank you to Chris, to Adam and their teams as well for helping to develop this. I think that we now have better quality information and more visible information than we had previously, and hopefully that's helpful and reinforces what we're trying to do across the piece in terms of providing that good quality information. Just to reiterate on a couple of comments I think that have been previously made. The first of which is this is now getting a really good drilling down to through senior officer groups. So we have a group called PARC, which is a performance and resources assurance resources committee that I chair, but includes all the other exec directors and senior managers as well. We go through this risk register every time we meet on a monthly basis to understand what the key risks are and to monitor those. And also we're increasingly looking at the risk register and particularly the issues that come from it at a CMT level as well. So actually we're getting some really, really good traction, I think, in relation to that. The other thing might be just in relation to how this committee would like to think about taking risks forward in the future and using your time, I guess, to get the maximum benefit. As well as looking at the overall risk register, it may be worth thinking about adopting a similar approach to one we discussed with overdue scrutiny recently, which is to drill down into some of the risks at different meetings. So it may be that you want to identify 1 or 2 risks to pick up and ask the relevant lead officer to come here and to drill down more into it, to have that understanding around that risk at future meetings, as well as looking at the overview. But I'd leave that as a potential suggestion that you may or may not wish to pick up for future meetings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Open.
JP, can you remind me what our role is in this? I think that the way Chris and Adam have produced these risk registers is much, much clearer than anything we've had before. It concerns me that there are 8 of the 16 still very high residual risk, but I'm pleased with what Nick has described about what officers are doing about it. But I would like to know, before we agree to deep dives or whatever, what the board's role is and what our role is. I thought we were here to ensure that a risk register was produced rather than to delve in too deeply about the individual scores of particular elements. But sounds like Edwin has got a good answer here.
The 7th Cavalry.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so one of the statutory powers of this committee is to review and assess the authority's risk management. So you can drill down if you want, because you can assess it, you can review it, you can ask questions. I hope that answers your question.
Sorry, where does our work overlap with, say, overview and scrutiny and the board? I can see that we have a role, and I was thinking our role was to ensure a risk register was produced and to look at it and confirm that the structure of it looked right and that the right sort of items were being assessed rather than the individual scores for individual items. But I'm happy to be corrected about that, and then I'll really get stuck in.
Sorry, if I may, following on from the discussion that we had recently with Overview and Scrutiny Committee, I think it's clear that Overview and Scrutiny Committee want to be focused on the outcomes and the impacts of policies that are being developed, both at an early stage in terms of a pre-development and at a later stage in terms of actually have those policies done what they were supposed to do, and what are the outcomes in relation to that. I think their role is probably less around actually looking at the individual risks and how well they're managed, albeit they will, I think, get into maybe some of those when looking at the policies. So to me, it's a question about risks themselves will not necessarily fall within the purview of Overview and Scrutiny Committee. And it's simply about what are the best mechanisms for this committee to help to assure yourself and yourselves that actually the authority does have the right approach to managing all of those critical risks and to ameliorating the impact of them in the future should they transpire.
Perhaps I should add, I mean, I share the comments about this. This is, to my mind, and we've been encouraging improvements both in the management of risks, but in the understanding of how they're managed. And this is a eureka moment, I think, this approach which we're now seeing, and which, Adam, you've introduced so clearly, because I think we now have a digestible information which allows us to see how the system is behaving. And I mean, there's a touch of the boy stood on the burning deck when you've got 8 red residual risks out of 20 or whatever it is, but that's a management problem. I think our role is not only is it being met, are the risks, it's the how. We need to satisfy ourselves, is the how, is it being managed effectively? Are we convinced that in good governance terms? And I think that does enable us to drill down, because now we've seen the corporate team. I think some value, I think, in maybe taking one risk and having the lead director, not to question their person's judgment about the issue, not the what and the why, but are they managing it in a way which we find convincing in governance terms? I think does that answer the point?
Yeah, that's very helpful. In which case, I would pick up Nick's suggestion that we do a deep dive of the elements relating to funding and money. As an example, we could do future viability, inflation, future funding, and there's another one, financial underspend, as examples of very high residual risks, which we would like to understand more about as to how management are dealing with those. But let's others to have a view.
Wants to say something in regard to that?
Yeah, absolutely. With regard to some of the red risks, I think what we might need to do is to go away and look at the scoring definitions. So what we do with the risks is we score them. So they're ever red, amber, green, and so on. But when we look at the scoring definitions that we have at the moment, so we're looking at, are they likely to happen, how severe it will be. The financial ones, for example, anything over £300,000, potentially could be affected. That's always going to be critical. So finance-wise, if you look at the organisation, an awful lot of the work is over £300,000. So therefore, even if you put the mitigations in, a critical piece could still be there. Now, I think there might be an opportunity to revisit those scoring definitions. Now, as part of the improvement work that Angela was talking about earlier, we're updating the risk management framework. We talked about the risk appetite statement and so on. So I think it would be helpful for the committee if we go back and have a look at those definitions and make sure they're more realistic.
Chair, if I may.
Simon.
Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I think, yes, I agree that review and assess is part of our remit. I think it'd be helpful to just see how this context is brought to life through some worked examples. And I trust the officers to choose ones which perhaps were going badly, and that the system has been applied and has made a correction to to the risk assessment and the responses to the risk, so we can understand why it wasn't being done properly in the first place, how it was spotted, what the intervention was, and how we got into a better place. So we can understand the journey that's going on within the organisation about how this system has actually been, the operational part of the system, how it's been made to work. And if we can see that that's effective, then I think we can make a judgment on we can do our job. We just say we're actually confident about this risk management system and culture.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's very helpful. So
yeah, thank you, Chair. My point was actually, it actually gives us a mechanism of exactly what you're just saying. Really, I think the heat map, I think, is a great tool. I think it's a really easy tool to use. But just the simple addition of if you look at the heat map, the circles you've got with the numbers, just having an arrow on that circle of direction of movement, because we look at a RAG list and something's red, it's red. Yes, there is information on another page that explains why that's red, but from us to look at it quickly, you think, well, actually, so I'll pick on number 8. So if that's sat there and it hasn't moved, it's going to ring out to us. Whereas if it's got an arrow that it's moving towards amber, that's the direction that it's less of a concern for us. So you do the deep dive on the ones that are static, and not not moving in the direction we'd like them to, or if they're going in the opposite direction, obviously it makes it but just a simple addition of an arrow. I don't know if that's an achievable or if it's a viable thing. But.
Did you hear that?
I did, thank you. As we go through this over time, we'll be able to show you different parts of the data points, if you like. So as scores move and the trends over time, you'll be able to have on here, for example, the movement from inherent to residual to target, but then also we'll be able to, as the months go by, show you the trajectory of each risk over time. So you'll be able to see where it was at the end of June, the end of July, end of August. So that will allow you to then have confidence in whether it's being managed or whether it's sort of stagnant, I guess, from a position point of view. So there are a raft of different ways of presenting this information. And as we get further through the implementation and more, as those park conversations take place and the CMT conversations, we'll be able to capture that and then bring that back to the committee.
Okay, thank you. And I think the proposition was if the movement symbols in the big chart could be included in the circle, you get it at a quick glance. Now, whether that's technically feasible or more trouble, what I'd ask you is to go and look at that proposal and decide whether it's practical. Because I do take the point that if there's ways, the more you can get an alert on one chart might make you go to another. Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. I'm loath to speak because obviously I don't know any of the background and I don't want to speak out of turn. I have sat on many risk audit meetings and risk meetings, and I've seen maps and charts like this many times. They all look absolutely brilliant. And if you haven't had them, then first of all, fantastic work by whoever's put them together. But I especially here in the conversation, I am a little wary because, for example, inflation, the top button on the map on page 29. What projects have you got under management control that will affect inflation? Inflation isn't something in your control directly, but you do have projects that might be at risk were inflation to get out of control. But are those projects linked to these blobs in a very easy way? Because it seems to me, if you've got this massive stuff, in my experience of them, it's easy to follow arrows moving up and down and blobs moving up and down when it's risky. What you want to link is the actual actions that people are doing within the management projects that they've got, which are being controlled by the thing before the blob starts to move. Or maybe I've got it wrong. Maybe that is the purview of the overview committee rather than this one. Maybe that is where the link goes. And I'm sorry if I've spoken out of turn. I apologise.
Unless they break the rules of civil.
Thank you. I think it's a really good point, actually. Yeah, Councillor Shepherd. I think that just picking on that inflation one, for instance, you're right. Some of these risks we can't actually control. The risk itself. None of us sitting here in this room can control what inflation is going to be in the UK or indeed globally over the next year or so. However, what we can do is, by knowing that inflation is a risk, we can actually look at the way we deal with our projects and do them differently. So, for instance, one of the things we're trying to do is to look to see, can we potentially forward buy or contract with people at an earlier stage to defray some of the potential risk around inflation. Where we may not be able to do that, can we actually provide additional funding? So the board at its last meeting set up a specific inflation reserve to cover some of the risks of inflation on those key projects moving forward. That's something that we wouldn't probably have brought to the board's attention, and they may not have done, without identifying inflation as a key risk, actually. So again, that's coming back to the point that was raised previously about where this has been beneficial. I think that's one area already through there. So yeah, absolutely, it's not one that we can actually deal with the likelihood of inflation, but it's one that we can deal with the impact of inflation. It's that we're trying to do to reduce that impact coming through, if that's helpful. Yes. Sorry. Yes, yeah. As I said previously, it's by identifying the risk of inflation that we're now changing the way we deal with some of our projects to try and reduce the impact of inflation, and also the setting up of that inflation reserve, which wouldn't have happened unless we identified inflation as a key risk and started to think differently about that, about how we might manage that in the future. So absolutely, and actually having this in place, I think, has been really beneficial to a lot of management effort across the whole of the combined authority to identify the risks and see how we can think differently about how we deal with them.
Gary.
Yes, a couple of questions around that. I think it sort of echoes what Councillor Shepherd was talking as well about there. I think this for me, sort of, they've got the corporate risk register here, and it's are the same sorts of processes or approach being used for project risk registers as well. And the second one is also around progress on the 4 risk training. I think it's brilliant, these reports. I had a look from when they came through. Absolutely incredible the amount of work that must have gone into putting those together. I can only guess as to how much work it's taken to do those. But it'd be good to sort of understand how that 4 risk training is being rolled out and how that's being progressed as well.
Perhaps if I could just comment briefly in relation to the individual project risk registers, and then Chris and Adam can come on and say a bit more about that, and also talk about the training that I know has been rolled out in individual areas. So in terms of the individual projects, yes, absolutely. Every single one of those has got a very, very detailed risk register. Just to give an example of that, as part of my responsibility, I sit on one of the property companies that's helping to deliver one of the buildings at the University of Peterborough. I think we have a risk register there that carries about 20 or 25 individual separate risks, all to a very detailed level. You wouldn't see that on here. You see the overall University of Peterborough coming through. So actually there is a really detailed one for every single project that we run as an organisation. Obviously on some of the very small projects, it's significantly less and it's proportionate to the complexity and the amount of cost of the project. But yes, that does exist. And in relation to the training, I know that Chris and Adam will want to come in on this in a second. We started rolling the training out, but we've picked up, as I say, initially CMT and the exec directors first, and then rolling it through there. And I know Chris and Adam, you want to talk about the rollout schedule from now on in.
Yeah, just to follow up on your point around the sort of project level risk register and so on, they're all the same template. So the all the information sort of correctly allocated on the template. The risk training, we wanted to have this committee first, and then we're going to sit down and we're meeting next week to run through the implementation of the software, equally the training that's associated with that. So we think we're going to start it this month, run it through to probably September for the full implementation. So we have all the information that we need. We just need to plan out exactly when we're going to do it.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just a couple of points really about the risk register. The appendix with all of the pie charts, and I appreciate we're dealing with 16 risks here, but there aren't any numbers on some of them. I just wonder if that might elevate understanding a little bit there. Obviously, as a new member of this committee, I haven't had your initial training that I think you did in March, so I'm very pleased to hear that there's further training coming. The fundamental question for me is about the hierarchy of risk moving between project or operational and coming up into the strategic side, and how you identify the risks that are coming up from maybe project level or operational level and coming up to this, and how you would then bring them in. And 16 is a significant number of corporate risks, but I'm sure there are very many others that are just bubbling under the surface that you're looking at, and how that would develop in terms of your process. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for the question. So what we do is we have our project ones program level or service level registers, as we mentioned, in the same template. We have the performance and risk resources committee, so the internal officer group with all the executives on, and we expect the executive directors to be pulling up those risks as need be. So if there's something going wrong with one of their particular programs or projects, and they feel that it's grown to a stage where it needs to be considered corporately, then we'll have that discussion in that meeting. We decide as a group, okay, we need to add that to the corporate risk register. So that's how we tend to sort of handle those risks. Sometimes you may have ones that come from left field, your COVID and your black swan events and all that sort of thing. Then we just make a concerted effort just to make sure it gets on sort of straight away. And equally, as Nick sort of mentioned earlier, it's now looked at CMT as well. So it's looked at all levels, and that's where we need to really get that embedding work done.
If I may come back, Chair. The other bit, I think, looking at it is the assumptions around the target priorities. There's a lot in the green, and we want to argue some of those about whether that's achievable. Could you just go through the process about how you come up with that target priority? Is that a wish list, dare I say, or are there sort of metrics behind that?
Could I take that question, if that's okay, Chris?
Yeah, happily, Adam. I'll follow on up.
So the risk appetite statement, which we've been developing with CMT, that will be used to help influence those target scores based upon the appetite, because I appreciate some of those are green in the yellow and actually they may be unachievable. So the idea being that actually the appetite drives a level of comfort as to where the organisation is able to manage those exposures to. So I think at the moment they are based around the actions, the judgment, and the discussion, and a willingness to reduce the exposures. But the idea moving forwards is that once we've agreed the risk appetite, we'll be able to use that to influence the end goal from an exposure point of view and that target priority. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try and sum up a bit. I think the fact we've had such a productive discussion is a testament to the way the information is being put in front of us today, because you can only get your teeth into something if there's something to eat. And rather than these great massive charts, we've now got an insight. I think from what we've heard, I think we'd like two, or if you may think that's too much, one deep dive at the next meeting with the lead here to explain those operational process issues, including the risk appetite, the horizon scanning, and the like, that takes up the theme of these conversations. And we don't want to consume a whole committee meeting on it, so it'll be a judgment on how much you put on the table, but it will give us an opportunity to pursue these things. We'd like an insight too from your own comments regarding the gradings of the that give such high scores, and because those assumptions drive the nature of it, it does seem, from an experience point of view, that notwithstanding the challenges of the authority, there's too many reds at the residual level. And yes, we can just change the statistics to make it look nicer. That's not what we're talking about, but it's whether they're robust as opposed to too far at the pessimistic. I mean, I think an example when I was in working in the Antarctic business, with impact, death was high on our risk register, but it wasn't red because managing it and got it down. So the impact, there are certain things that always have to be on the register to be by virtue of the impact, but where they sit in relative to how you manage them, it's. I think, to my mind, it's always been good that management are talking about this and wrestling with unanswerable questions, because that's what gets it more effective. And the other point I think would be a thumbnail insight to the progression of training rollout. I think that covers the essence of the discussion, unless anybody wants to. Then I've got a final thing on the naming of parts, which I'm wrestling, I must admit, with coming to terms with the new paper format which has been introduced. Obviously, the corporate way of doing this. I have a tongue-in-cheek comment, but the comment I thought was surprising, and I know it was that I am put down as the lead member for risk at the top of the paper. Now, I never like to do anything executive when I'm a non-executive. I think that's nice of you to put it that way, but I assume that there's a big hitter within the organisation who's in charge of the whole risk system. Is he sitting on my left?
If I may, I think there's some, certainly from an officer perspective, as I say, the chief executive, myself, and CMT are taking the lead from an officer perspective. I think actually that from a member perspective, Edwina, you may want to look to see if that's Councillor Murphy in her governance responsibility, rather than John Pye as chairman of this committee. I think that's probably a typo on that one. So well spotted, and my apologies.
Well, no, I just find it interesting. And the other thing is the naming of parts. Is when you go down to the risk register, when we have, if I go to the first one, we have the owner. We just use the names. Now, I mean, I know some of them, but I think to give this the impact, it needs to be clear that this is the director. the senior person on the CMT as a title. Now, whether that means you have to dump the name or you can find, I mean, we always want more stuff on the form, don't we? We don't want too big of a form. So that's your challenge. But I think over time, when you look back to it, you would say, that was the director of so-and-so rather than a person. Okay. Good. I think that's a job well done. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you.
Sorry, we move on to item 6, which is the internal audit action tracker. Chris Bolton will present. I've got on my list. Okay, is he with us or are you? Nathan. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, that was my, I was just reading off my piece of paper. So we're going to note the progress of the internal audit action tracker and to note the procurement and implementation of the corporate risk and internal audit software to track the internal audit actions.
Yeah,
Nathan,
thank you,
over to you.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Sorry I couldn't attend in person. So, like you said, Chair, this item is to note the progress of the internal audit tracker. So in total, there are 106 actions on the tracker. There's 102 complete and now only 4 overdue. A snapshot of the overdue actions are in Appendix 1, and I'll briefly go through these now. So there's one on subsidiary company governance, which is overdue. This will be complete following the development of a Propco 2 business plan, which is expected to be complete within the next month. There are 2 data protection deep dive actions overdue, both of which are due to be complete by the end of September. Progress of on these have been made with the code of conduct forms and member induction program information now complete. And there is 1 payroll action overdue. The relevant officer has now been allocated to this and work has begun on quarterly payroll checks to be implemented by September 2023. So following on from the previous item and Chris talking about the implementation of 4 risk, this item is also to note the procurement and implementation of the internal audit software, which will be a module on 4 risk. And this will be software to track internal audit actions. So we currently track internal audit actions, as you can see, through Appendix 1, through a Excel spreadsheet. And although this is used with best intentions, the current tracker is difficult to administer and view, and it's not fully auditable. So this new software will allow greater visibility of actions across the organization. It'll be easily accessible to action owners and allow easier reporting. So there'll be, for example, email reminders if an owner has a live action. There'll be automatic chaser emails. Owners will be able to easily log in and provide an update and close that update. So it closed the action subject to verification, and there'll also be an escalation process attached to it. So that's all for my update on the internal audit tracker. Thanks for having me, and if you've got any questions, please just let me know.
Thank you very much, Nathan. I open it for discussion. Questions? Andy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. The outstanding issues around data protection, I note there's one about whether members are adequately trained. It's a bugbear of mine about how do you know that they're adequately trained? If they've done a course or they say they've done a course, that's not necessarily doing that level of internal audit to say yes, that's adequate and sufficient. And I'm just wondering if there is some way of ensuring that the information you get actually means that individuals have done the training and not just ticked a box. Thank you.
Nick Bell is going to save you, Nathan.
Thank you. I think it's a really good point, actually, in terms of ensuring that people have the training and the right quality of the training through there. The way we're currently dealing with this is that all the constituent councils provide training on data protection to their members, which is not compulsory, but my understanding is the vast majority of members do that. So we're actually picking it up through the information governance leads from those councils to ensure that actually the members who are linked into the combined authority have actually had that training, undertaken the training. There may still be some gaps once that's completed. We're just finalising that now. If that is, we'll fill those gaps in by doing further training here within the combined authority ourselves to make sure that every single one of the members has had that training.
Thanks, that's great. I think the question for me is, I sit on the pension committee, for example, and there's mandated training that I have to take to be able to do that role. Is it within the remit of governance to be able to say that members who sit on the board or who sit on these scrutiny committees should also be mandated rather than voluntary?
I think that's certainly something that we can look at in terms of trying to ensure that people have the right training and mandatory. There are some interesting, I believe, legal guidelines and issues in relation to what can be made mandatory and what can't, which I would defer to Edwina, who's far more knowledgeable about this than I am. But certainly that would be the aim where possible to try and make really important training that, again, links to some of the key risks that we looked at recently, as mandatory and as fully comprehensive as it possibly can be.
Yeah, so okay. So yes, if this committee wants to maybe propose or make a recommendation to the board to consider that, the CA board, that's something that this committee can do. But with regard to specifically data protection training, the way it works is the Information Commissioner's Office regards members, and this has been an issue ongoing for years, members as data processors. Therefore, they're responsible for any breaches as opposed to the local authority. So that's the reason why it's difficult to mandate. But if the CA board decides that anyone who's sitting on a committee has to do these training, then that would be and that's adopted, and that will be the process going forward. What I would add to that, it's in the best interest of every member really to attend the training because it's very easy with a lot of cybersecurity issues for members to inadvertently breach data protection rules. So I suppose that's my plug. It would be in every member's best interest to attend training. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any other comments? I don't think I'll take us down the training rabbit hole on this topic, but I think it's an indication, it seems to me, that the challenge, Nathan is the scorekeeper and is taking feedback from the officers who are responsible for implementing, but the tracking system doesn't answer the question that it was underneath, and that's for another day, perhaps. Gary.
Yeah, so it's just a very quick question. It talks about the cost of the 4Risk software and section 5.1, £10,000 per annum. I just wondered, is that sort of unlimited numbers of users, or is it a license based? Because I believe it's cloud based, the 4Risk software as well, isn't it?
Who could answer that? Has he left the room? No. Can you answer that?
Would you like me to come in on that, Chair?
Do you have the answer, Nathan?
Yeah, so speaking to RSM, whose software we'll be using, there'll be enough licenses for the organisation. So if there's if somebody has a action on the internal audit tracker, they will automatically be told through email that they've got that action. So it will cover everybody in the organisation who's gotten a action on the tracker. So there are definitely enough licenses. That 10,000 as well is inclusive of the full 4Risk cost. So that is also the risk software, which the internal audit is one module of. So it's for the full 4Risk cost.
Thank you, Nathan. Okay. Well, I think we welcome very much putting in place the system that you briefed us on, Nathan. Um, not sure we need to look at this too often unless there's a worry. So I would suggest, members, we ask once a year for insight, probably in the early part of each calendar year when we're leading up to our annual report, unless there are concerns by the people managing the trackers who need to bring it to our attention beforehand. Otherwise, an annual report. Are we content? Thank you. Thanks again, Nathan.
Thank you.
Item 7, the procurement review amendments to the Constitution. We're recommending that we're being asked to recommend that the Combined Authority Board approve the changes and the strategy. And I look who is going to introduce this. Chantel, and this is your first time, I'm told. Don't worry, we're jolly nice people, apart from some.
I'm going to ask you if you can please take it easy on me today. The nerves are. So, a paper was brought to the committee last month with recommendations and action plan following the procurement review undertaken by PwC. One of the recommendations highlighted was to revise the procurement strategy, policy, and procedures, which work had already begun on and commissioned. With the new procurement bill that's upcoming, we wanted to review the contract procedure rules within the Constitution at the same time. The way that the CPRs were written, we took a decision to strip the practicalities out of it, of like the procurement, which would be better suited within the strategy, policy, and guidance documents, which are still being worked up. It covers our legal and statutory requirements, the way it's written now, and for the current legislation and the new bill that's upcoming. This would mean that we wouldn't have to bring this back to the committee each and every time an update or change is required.
How different is this from what was before?
Previously, the CPRs worked hand in hand with the policy documents. So some of the information was in one document, some of the information was in the other. Now all the practicalities of the actual procurement process is taken out of the CPRs. So we're covered legally and our statutory obligations are there.
Thank you. Nick Weiner.
Thank you. Just to add to what Chantel said, historically we've had a policy document and a set of contract procedure rules, but historically we haven't had a proper procurement strategy, I think, until very recently. So this will be the very first procurement strategy, I think, that we've had certainly for quite a while as an organisation. And it's designed so that you have those three effective documents, a policy, which then leads to the strategy, and then the CPRs, the contract procedure rules, which are about the detailed way that which the strategy is operated within the combined authority, as three critical documents that will form the basis of very solid best value procurement for us in the future.
Thank you, Nick. Comments, questions?
Thanks, JP. I must admit, I got slightly confused with this because I couldn't find Appendix 1 or Appendix 2 clearly defined, although I think the first time the procurement strategy is printed, it's Appendix 1, and then the second time is the old one. Like you, it would have been very helpful to identify exactly what the difference was. But if I've got it right, on page 44 of the papers, which is sort of 47 of the pack, it talks about contract duration as a heading, but then as far as I can see, there doesn't seem to be anything about contract duration other than it requires officers to decide the contract duration and potential extension without giving the criteria that they should use. So, for example, you might have a relatively long contract if the tenderer is expected to invest in a lot of plant or equipment or something, and it will take a while to get a return on his money. On the other hand, you might decide that you're going to have a relatively short duration contract if it's absolutely clear and it's just a bit of almost consultancy work. So on the assumption that I'm doing it correctly, it would be helpful, I think, if there was a bit more explanation about the criteria to be used in determining contract duration included here. Otherwise, it's extremely comprehensive and thorough, I think.
Chantal, please.
The idea is to put all that information into an actual guidance document for officers, which is more clear and comprehensive for them to follow.
Thank you very much, Chair. Maybe I missed it in the paperwork, but please forgive me if I have. But the transforming public procurement process that the government's introduced, is there likely to be some changes as a result of that legislation coming through from this current document? And have you scoped that already?
Perhaps if I can answer first, and then Chantal can potentially come in with any more detail if required. Absolutely. Part of the PwC review that we asked for was to make sure that what we were doing was future-proof in relation to the procurement bill that is now going through Parliament and will become law, we anticipate, certainly by spring of next year. So everything that we've done in terms of the policy, the strategy and the CPRs, we anticipate will be future-proof in relation to that. But of course, until the final legislation is laid and is passed, we don't know whether or not there might be some other issues that we need to take on board. But from our understanding of it at the moment, it's passing through Parliament. I think the vast majority, if not all, of those issues will be taken on board by this. I believe that's right, Chantal. Thank you.
Any other comments? Okay, I got a couple. Well, one about the context of this is to amend the constitution, wherein or the combined authorities in catch-up. Our practice hitherto had been to try and hold everything for an annual constitution review. We're not going to. We will get back onto that eventually, but of course, this business has to be done. But how you talked about updates and changes? There's the guidelines, but the constitutional bit. What's your assessment of how often this is going to change?
If it is in fact future-proofed, then it wouldn't need to be changed that often because it's now it's not specifying which legislation, it's saying applicable legislation. So we're hoping if there are any changes, it's going to be minor, not substantial.
Okay. Well, I just encourage us always to try and have future-proof in the constitution because it's a mass of words and complexity, and that's one of the reasons we tried to do it in a big event each year because then you can see, but we can't do that at the moment. Okay, right. Another couple of questions. The puts a lot of power into the procurement and contracts managers' hand. Let me get the right word here. The procurement manager has a lot of power. I'm not sure I saw anything that, I know how. I mean, in my experience, these power centres can be tricky because compliance is important, but equally you need to be able to find another way of dealing with it if there's an impasse between what a user wants and what the contracts person thinks. Is there anywhere in the guidelines for a referral if the person the project person and the contract person can't agree? Because there's regulation, but there's also opinion, isn't
Thank you. Perhaps again, if I could just comment on that one, then once again, Chantal can pick up any more detail. You're right, there are sometimes issues of opinion as opposed to issues of fact or legislation. Certainly, I would expect that issues in relation to regulation legislation, there is 100% compliance in relation to what is required by the procurement department, because that protects the interests of the combined authority. I think where there are differences of opinion in terms of actually how things should be done, that's an area that I would expect to be raised and escalated through procurement to either Edwina as monitoring officer or to myself to deal with and take a view, and potentially even to CMT if required in those circumstances. And that is certainly allowable in there in terms of matters of opinion, but not in terms of matters of regulation or legislation.
Thank you. When we received the consultants' report at our previous meeting, we touched on monitoring and how the system is working. How is that going to be done?
The system that we've got in place for procurement, or just the way it's working in general?
Well, the characteristic of the procurement activity and the effectiveness of the application and the compliance.
So that's going to be next on the agenda on our list to action and implement. We are looking at systems and ways of tracking and monitoring the progress and activities.
Thank you. Chantal's absolutely right. And just to remind the committee that we undertook at the last meeting to bring a more detailed action plan to the September meeting of this committee that will look at actually how we implement the new operating model, particularly in relation to key performance indicators, which I think will give this committee the assurance it needs that we're actually operating well and meeting the policy intent of that procurement policy as well, not just in relation to value for money, but its wider intent as well through social value and other aspects in relation to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for reminding me of that, because commitment. We look forward to that, because the words might be mellifluous, but we've got to see it in action, and you've got to change the culture of the organisation to follow this. So we do look forward to an insight to that. We were asked if we recommend this to the Combined Authority Board. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you, Chair. And apologies for I couldn't find the section I was looking for at the point where I should have raised a point. But I noticed the procurement policy talks about social value element of procurement, but it doesn't specifically reference carbon emissions or climate change in it. I thought, well, referring back to our risk register, that is one of our risks, and I just wondered if should it? I mean, you can imagine situations where you could have two competing suppliers, and one has developed a lower carbon process than the other, and therefore that should have some impact on the choice between those.
So that's normally addressed in the scoring of the bids. It's in our scoring matrix. So if somebody answers a question in full, they get 4 marks. But if they got the added value, that's where they get the 5 marks, and that's where the difference is made. So it's related to the question and the subject matter.
I think Nick wants to.
Sorry, thank you as well. Just to add to what Ms. Chantal said, I mean, obviously, in relation to the policy document, that's looking at actually with the things that we want to actually bring in for the combined authority and the wider benefits coming through from there. And Chantal's right in terms of the detailed scoring that we can then do, which should be through the guidance rather than a policy. But in terms of the policy itself, I think the key one on there is on page 4, which is around carbon emissions and energy usage reductions, including net zero. Sorry, page 4 of the appendix, which is to encourage suppliers to have carbon reduction plans and to commit to achieving net zero by 2050, which I think is the key issue in terms of the policy. So trying to make sure that those people we are contracting with are supporting that reduction in carbon emission.
think we can be assured of that when we've got somebody in Nixville who knows where it is and what page. Okay, so thank you very much, Antel, and Nick, for all your advice, and we recommend as asked. Do it again. We move on to item 8, which is the Treasury Management Outturn Report. And after our last meeting, we did have a development session on the intricacies of Treasury management. And we are asked to review and note the actual performance for the year to the 31st of March. And the paper will be introduced by Ian Pantling, who's joined us. Ian, you have the floor.
Sorry, Chair, I think if I could maybe present the paper, that's okay. Ian's here to answer any technical questions that
Okay.
may come.
Sorry, Ian,
So my apologies. Thank you. So just to introduce the report briefly, this is the annual report of the activity that we undertake in relation to both our investments, any borrowing that we may undertake as an authority. It's one, as I say, that we provide every single year. I would like to bring the members' attention to the fact there has been a technical breach of the policy this year, which is mentioned in the report, which is where the counterparty limit was breached for a weekend. We received £22 million of cash one Friday, and we couldn't move that out until the following Monday. That meant that with that counterparty, we were £31 million invested over the course of the weekend rather than our internal limit of 25 million. So a technical breach, but actually it didn't cause any issues or loss of funds to us. But I did want to bring that to members' attention. It's obviously difficult when funds arrive late on a Friday to get them moved until after the weekend. You'll see as well there is a minor typo in the report. My apologies on that one. In Appendix 1, the counterparty limit with other banks should be £25 million and not £25. It'll be slightly difficult to do it on that basis. I just want to draw your attention to that. Also worth noting that despite the fact that we have got some limits in relation to borrowing, we haven't used borrowing at all during the course of the last financial year, and therefore we have no debt or borrowing indicators that you'll see all the way through. They're all zero in relation to those. And just worth saying that we've met all of the other indicators as well in terms of treasury management. And of course, during the course of the year itself, members of the committee will be aware that that we exceeded estimation in relation to treasury management investment activity from a combination of more surplus cash than we anticipated and also higher than anticipated interest rates. That enabled us to be able to do that. And that was reported to the main combined authority board at its meeting on the 31st of May, at which point, as I mentioned previously, they decided to use some of that additional funding to set up a inflation contingency reserve for this year. That's probably all I want to say just in terms of introduction of the report. As I say, Ian is here to answer any technical questions that may come up from the committee in relation to that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Nick, thanks very much. I'm just wondering whether this Friday thing is not a surprise, is it? You could almost predict it's going to be difficult. Is there some form of automation that the counterparty should be able to put in place which would mitigate that, rather than expect you to try to pull this together at the last minute?
I think it's generally the case. We have good warning when cash is coming in. I think in this particular instance, I was on a period of long-term sick myself personally, and other members of the team were filling in the roles I would normally undertake, and I think that was a large part of the cause of this particular breach.
So thank you. And if I just if you recall earlier on in the meeting when we talked about financial resilience and building that in now, that's to try and make sure that other members of the team can now pick those areas and issues up. So say our combined apologies that we reached the counterparty limit on that occasion, but say there was no detrimental impact on the combined authority whatsoever.
Caroline.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, I'm not sure if this is an appropriate question, but I just looked at the capital strategy indicators, the capital expenditure in millions. And I always look at the column when it says budget and outturn, and we see that there is quite a significant slippage, which I've learnt is a council term for underspending of capital which you carry forward. I just wondered, is that something the council should note or the committee should note? Is that why do we have underspending of capital budgets? Is it something that we should be interested in? Probably not, as this is treasury function, I understand that. So maybe it's not a relevant question here.
No, it's can we? Yeah.
Thank you. It's a huge relevant question, actually. It's one that we've been reporting to the board as well during the course of certainly the outturn report that came through and the previous budget monitoring reports in both March and May this year. There are a number of different reasons for the capital slippage. Some of it has been down to the way we've budgeted historically and not necessarily having the timing right around those. So we've improved that now for this year. Some of it has been down to the fact that actually when we're commissioning projects, the project delivery has slipped for some particular reason. I know during the spring this year, a lot of the construction work and other issues were delayed because of the wet spring that we had. Some of it is down to the fact that we don't always get the information at times from the contractors or third parties. So, for instance, they may have completed the work, but simply not invoiced us. So we're not aware of that coming through. So again, we're putting work in place which are reported to the main board, so that actually we've got a faster set of information coming through to us from the individual contractor as well. So you will see, hopefully, and the board will see that this is an improving issue over the course of this year, and the amount of slippage is reducing because we've actually got better forecasting, better ways of delivery, and better information coming through from the contractor back to us on a timely manner. But you're absolutely right to raise it as an issue, so it's been raised by the board itself. And
I don't think I've ever been in an organisation where the capital programme came in the budget.
This is on the table on page 166. Could you explain why you outperformed your peers in terms of total return on capital?
perhaps Ian would like to come into this, but my understanding is it's down to the combination of how we adopted long and short-term investment strategies. But Ian, do you want to give a bit more detail around that?
Yeah, so this is the so I'm looking at different page numbers. Is this the Island Close benchmarking? Yeah. In terms of our investment returns, I think probably at the time it was during a rising rate environment, and we were able. We've got if you look at the sort of towards the top of that table, we've got a larger investment balance than quite a lot of our sort of peers at the time, and we were able to, I think, place more funds for longer periods. So we were gaining the increased rate you get from locking in for a longer period, whereas they would probably have a lot of theirs more at a shorter term because it's to maintain the same levels of short-term cash. They needed a higher proportion of theirs at that sort of rate.
I'll ask a further question. So, is the combined authority ever going to engage in borrowing?
That will obviously be a key policy decision for the Combined Authority Board. As part of this year's budget, as part of last year's budget, we set aside up to £500,000 to cover the cost of servicing borrowing, should it be required, but that was not required last year. We also have that availability this year within the budget, but to date, the Combined Authority Board has not indicated that it wishes to move forward with any borrowing to fund the capital programme. It could do under the orders that we were established with, if it wished to do so.
It's a concern because obviously we've got very limited revenue, and it's static revenue which is being eroded by inflation, and borrowing would have implications for revenue and further shrink the available revenue to run the organisation. So I think that would be a real issue if the board decided to stop borrowing. I mean, I'm thinking of the finance costs as well as the MRP implications.
Perhaps I just say that trespasses into the what and the why, I think, rather than the how. I'm sure you're right. Okay, with those comments, don't see any more comments. With those comments, we note the report. Thank you very much, Ian, for being here to answer the technical. Sorry, I thought put you in pole position at the beginning. And thank you, Nick. So we'll close that item and move on to the draft statement of accounts and the annual governance statement. And we're asked both, these are for, well, we have to get the timelines right. This is 22-23 we're looking at, which I don't think will be audited until next year sometime, in calendar years. Is that right, Mark? No earlier than November. Okay. So we're going back in time to note the governance statement and the draft statement of accounts. And the man who's been working so hard today, Nick, is going to introduce it.
Thank you. Actually, the hard work has been done by Ian and colleagues who've pulled this together, and Ian is here again to answer any detailed questions. So perhaps first of all, may start with an apology. While we sent out the annual governance statement on time with the papers, the actual statement of accounts, because we're still working on it, was distributed slightly late to the committee, so I can apologise for that. And then also, just to mention the fact again that that we have missed the statutory publication deadline on the statement of accounts. However, to put it into context, we have brought the accounts through, and we intend to publish these. Hopefully, I'll talk about why we haven't published them yet, within the next 2 weeks. That will be 4 months earlier than we published the accounts last year, which were in November. So a significant improvement in relation to that. The statutory period for the publication of accounts last year was the 31st of July. So although it's moved forward this year to the 31st of May, you know, it would still have been a situation where, had it been last year, we would have met that deadline. And just to mention as well that many other councils are also late in publishing their accounts, the statutory deadline, both locally and nationally. However, that's not an issue that I'd be keen to follow on for future years. It's the first time in my career as a chief finance officer that we have actually published statement of accounts late and not met the statutory deadline, and I hope it will be the last time in my career that we do that. So an apology in relation to that, but we have been working very, very hard to pull those together. The reason why things have been late, and also some of you will see that at the moment the statements of accounts are still in draft format, and they may change in the next couple of weeks or so before publication. There may be a few minor tweaks that we need to make around those. We're still working on those. The main issues that are outstanding, the first is the valuation we're awaiting from the surveyors on the open market value of the 2 buildings at the University of Peterborough. This is likely to be a material difference in the accounts because they're currently held at historic cost, i.e. how much it's cost us to build the buildings, as opposed to their open market value. The open market value is likely to be lower than the historic cost because they are reserved for education purposes. and therefore cannot be used for other purposes beyond that stage. And also because the way we have constructed the arrangement with Anglia Ruskin University is to enable them to have a rent-free period at the start of their occupation, and that will be taken into account as well in the valuation through what's called a discounted cash flow mechanism that the valuers will use. That was always intended and always known when we actually entered into the arrangement with Anglia Ruskin University on both of these. We hope to have that valuation through from the surveyors within the next week or so. Well, I actually hoped I might have it to report today, but unfortunately I don't. But it should be imminent through there. And the other thing that we're missing at the moment is the final details to complete the related party transactions. I know Ian and his colleagues are just working on those now to ensure that we've got all of those information in place. And that's related party transactions from officers and members. We've got most of them. We're just trouble checking that there's no more outstanding before we finalise that. So what is not in the accounts at the moment, and there's most of it is there, but the things that are missing is on page 19, note 1, there is a table on the group boundary that is not complete yet. On page 49, note 10, the related party transactions are not yet complete. On page 63, note 25, the fair value table is not yet complete. That's what will be finalised by the valuations when they come in for the University of Peterborough buildings. And then also on page 69, the group accounts are not yet complete because we can't complete those until we have all the other entries. The entries themselves will not be that difficult to put through and will not have that many other implications, but it's important that they're there before we publish because they are likely to be material in terms of those changes through there. The report also includes the annual governance statement. And you will see that there are it has highlighted the significant governance concerns during the course of the year, including details of the external audit letter from June last year, the best value notice from January this year, the work that internal audits have done on the internal control environment, the changes we have brought in relation to governance and the constitution as part of that improvement programme, and the wider improvement activities that we've undertaken as well over the course of the year. Today, we're asking for Audit and Governance to review the annual governance statement and the draft statement of accounts and give any views on the draft statements, including the annual governance statement, before we finalise and we publish the draft statement of accounts later this month. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
I have a few questions, mainly relating to whether or not it will be helpful to add some further notes. So, for example, the fees payable with regard to external audit services carried out by the appointed auditor were 118,000 in 2021-22 and could be 31,000 22-23. Presumably they may go up if they have to do additional work. But at some stage, if there is a significant variance, I think it would be helpful to explain why there was a big difference. Similarly, there's an explanation about following the resignation of the chair of the business board, there was a period in which the role was vacant, resulting in a lower cost for 2022-23. That's very helpful, but it doesn't explain that we all supported JP's allowance going up, and gives an explanation for that. And then the final one, where I think it might be helpful to explain what it means, or at least tell me what it means. For some of the senior officer payments, it talks about third-party payments, and it doesn't always, as far as I can see, it doesn't explain to whom these are made, whether they were previous councils, whether they were, well, whatever they were. But it would be helpful if there was some explanation, particularly as they're quite significant amounts of money in some cases. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll certainly take those on board. The third party payments are for those people who've been on an interim basis covering senior officer roles. It's the interim costs of them, I believe, but we'll check that and make sure that we've got that explanation within the statement of accounts, and certainly pick up, I think, Ian, as well, if we could, maybe just those two detailed other points as well to make sure that we've got the right explanations in place. Thank you. I mean, it's always helpful to have separate eyes on these accounts as we try and make sure they're as transparent as they can be.
Sorry, all the ins and outs and the rest of it is gobbledygook to me. So I rely on Caroline and Andy and others to look at those.
Are we stunned by the volume and nature? Do we think the annual governance statement has made a fair stab at the circumstances regarding the combined authority last year? Okay. Ultimately, we have to approve the accounts. Today was to just note and give some feedback. Where are we in that timeline, do you think, that we'll get some accounts to look at where we have to approve? That's in our terms of reference.
Yes, the very final accounts will be ready in terms of final format, as I say, and ready for publication within the next couple of weeks before the end of July. Is my understanding, Ian?
Yeah, we've had something in terms of valuations during this meeting in a draft format. So we should have a final report hopefully later today or early next week, which is one of the key things we're working on. So it shouldn't be too long before we're able to get the draft accounts out. In terms of something to actually for the committee to actually approve, though, that won't be until the external audit has been complete, which I think is currently scheduled in for November. We're looking likely, but we're still undertaking our 2021-22 external audit, which is due to recommence early next month, though they are working on bits in between. So it'll be sort of dependent on those.
Thank you for that, Ian. So I think to sort of paraphrase that, it's like to be sometime significantly later in this municipal year for fully approving the 22-23 accounts post external audit. But of course, the 21-22 accounts, I believe, and hopefully Market External Audit can confirm this. We're working well through now resolving some of those outstanding issues. And I don't know if we've got a timeline now, Mark, for rough completion of those. Not trying to spot.
So, as Ian said, I think we're scheduled to come back in on the 7th of August to complete the field work. So we would either be reporting to the 9th of October or 4th of December meeting here for you to authorise the 21-22 financial statements.
Thank you. I just find it's hard to get my mind which year I'm thinking about. So we haven't done the previous ones, never mind this. And when we haven't had a discussion in our notes and review, we've had a couple of comments. And yet this is a big chunk of governance importance. Is this something that an area where a development session might help to give us some insights which might make the scrutiny of the accounts from an audit committee point of view more useful, meaningful, productive? Would members feel that it would be useful to have a development session on the accounts in how one should look at them and interrogate them?
I think it'd be helpful to me. I don't know about others. Whether that's something that should be provided by somebody within the combined authority or by somebody from the external auditor, I would leave for you to decide. But for us to know what questions to ask and what is significant and what is not significant, I think would be very helpful.
Thank you. Well, I won't answer the question of how we do it, but could I ask officers in consultation as appropriate with the external auditor to use one of our development session slots to educate us? So I think on that point, we can close this item for now. Okay, so we now go on to item 10, which is the member officer protocol, which we touched on some of the aspects of that in our earlier discussions. And Edwina will introduce it. We're reviewing the protocol, asked to recommend a yearly review to the Combined Authority Board, authorize the monitoring officer to make any changes that arise from the review, and note the information regarding instances where members have had to be referred to the protocol. Edwina.
Thank you, Chair. So as the Chair has said, he set out the four requests in the report. The member officer protocol came to this committee in June last year. And then the protocol was subsequently adopted by the Combined Authority Board on the 27th of July last year. Since the adoption, there hasn't been a review. So this report is asking as one of its recommendations that this committee carries out a yearly review. The member officer protocol, which is attached as Appendix 1, basically sets out the interaction between members and officers, what's expected of members and what's expected of officers when there is any interaction between both parties. And this report provides an update on how the protocol has been functioning since it was adopted last year. And in paragraph 3.2 of the report, I set out some occasions where members have had to be reminded of the protocol. So, as the monitoring officer, there have been 3 incidences where I've had to remind members of the protocol. On 2 other occasions, I became aware of officers raising issues around member behavior and whether the protocol applied. But the officers didn't want to progress the matter further. I gave them advice, but we're happy to just leave it as is. Because these matters are covered by data protection, I'm not able to mention the name of the members, but I am able to say that there are these incidents that have occurred. The other ask is whether you think there needs to be further review, further amends to the protocol, and that's something that we will take away, amend, and then put before the board if that's something you wish to do. So the recommendations are set out there. There are 4 recommendations, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Edwina. Comments? Questions?
I think this is very helpful. A few minor questions. One, I was slightly surprised to see no reference to civil specifically, because I thought, or the 3 Cs or something, because I thought that was something which underpinned everything that we were trying to do. Secondly, is there an equivalent officer to officer protocol, is that covered by other procedures that we should be aware of? Thirdly, there's reference to chief officers, and I think we know that that means chief executive and executive directors, but I just wonder whether it would be helpful to define that. And we've talked earlier about the link to the staff survey, so I think it'd be very helpful just to make sure that we have properly considered all the issues that were raised under that, and I think you have, but it'd be worth just doing it explicitly. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So, yes, in the Constitution, there is an officer code of conduct, which all officers must abide by. So that's in the Constitution. If I move on to your second question about chief officers, in the Constitution, Chapter 18, Rule 18.1.22, it sets out the definition of a chief officer. So it's in there. I just do want to duplicate. And I take the points on civil and staff survey, and I'll make sure that the next reports contain references to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Very interesting protocol, and I did read it. Just one question I have is that 4.7 says that junior officers should not be approached directly with requests for information or advice, but they should refer up to their manager. I think the issue for me is if a member of any committee of the legislative committees wants to ask a question of someone, how do they know the person to send that question to when they've seen a report, maybe with that officer's name on it, that may or may not be a junior officer? I think it's just a matter of process there, because you would want to fall foul of that by trying to contact the officer that's given you the information and then realise that you've probably breached that part of the protocol. Thank you.
Yes, whilst this protocol has been adopted by the board, I think in practicality, common sense will come into play. If there is an information that a member needs from an officer, and, a junior officer, and that's a name that they have, I don't think that that would then result in some sort of sanction against the member. I think common sense would come into play.
If I may, Chair, I absolutely agree with you. And I'm just wondering whether what you're trying to capture in the protocol is probably clearer than the way it reads. And maybe there may be just a little bit of consideration about what you're trying to protect there, because I think it could be misinterpreted, but thank you.
Can I just reinforce Andy's point, because that had not occurred to me before, but I have previously emailed Paul Nelson before he retired about buses and bus shelters and the like. And I'm beginning to think that under this, I probably shouldn't do it directly, even though I was doing it as a county councillor rather than as a member of Audit and Governance. How would that sort of dealing work in the future once this is adopted?
Just for clarity, this has already been adopted by by the board. It was adopted last year. So this is why this report is here. It's to seek your comments and whether there needs to be further amends, and then we can take it to the board. However, from the circumstances that you've just mentioned, you were approaching Paul as a county council councillor. The protocol applies to members of the combined authority. So if you're acting in your capacity as a member of the county council, I know it's a bit your dual hat in that sense, then we would personally I have to look, and under those circumstances it would be difficult for me then to want to apply this protocol to you if you're not acting as a member of Audit and Governance, but rather as your dual hat, a member of the county council.
Just in relation to those 2 points, I was just wondering, Edwina, perhaps if I could just ask you as monitoring officer, would it be possible to clarify that by maybe adding that if a member is, let's say, emailing for information, a slightly more junior officer, it might be considered good practice for them to copy in a more senior officer, just so that there is awareness in relation to that. And that probably covers that point in terms of protocol.
I'm grateful, Andy, for putting my eye on this paragraph, subparagraph. How do I know who is a junior officer? This is a. Can it not be rephrased that we should ask information of people of, I mean, who's a senior officer? I mean, the people we've met today, Chantel, for instance, what is she? A junior officer, senior officer? I've no idea.
If I may, sorry, can I?
Sorry,
thank you.
Stop and talk.
Sorry, no, sorry. If I may, Chair, perhaps I wasn't clear enough for that definition, and I mean, thank you for bringing that up. Perhaps the issue would be the relevant executive director might be clear, because there is clarity in terms of who's the executive director for each area, I believe, and if not, we'll make sure that all members have that information. So again, it's simply making sure that senior managers are aware if information is being requested, and the intent of this isn't to, in any way, shape, or form, deny information and to slow down that information trail. It is simply to ensure that that there is no risk. I'm sure it wouldn't happen here, but no risk of undue influence coming through, being brought to bear by a member onto a more junior officer.
Whilst I'm trying to think,
Just think perhaps the onus should be on the officer who's been approached to copy in the correct person, because the person that's asking for the information, as we've already discovered, may not know who it is that they need to speak to. So the onus should be on there. But I think, coming back to what Edwina said earlier on, I think the thing we have to be careful of as well is common sense. So apparently, that's not as common today as it used to be. So it's we have to be a little bit cautious of that, don't we? Sometimes as well.
okay, well, if I could ask officers to have a think about that paragraph of how can we put in a different way, because it's not easy to comprehend. When we, are there any other? I think there's a big issue here that one of the key reasons for the value for money intervention by the external auditor was behaviours. And yet we're being asked that the review is and it's all delegated to us. It seems to be a bit premature, I think, if we want to drive home the point that behaviours are a top of the shop matter, because behaviours stem from the top of the shop. So I'm not sure the delegation is necessarily timely. And and the other point that struck me was that, all wrapped up in the confidentiality point, we have three recorded instances of the protocol having to be brought to members' attention, i.e. breaches of it. And it seems to me that it's quite big to bring it to an attention. So that implies that underneath, behind that, there may be a lot of other uncomfortable behaviour patterns. Is this a matter of concern, and should we draw it to the attention of the Combined Authority Board that, given the importance and the significance of the improvement requirements in behaviours, we believe the board should be concerned, and that there's still a lot of work to be done. Because I think we should, well, I propose that we send quite a firm message to the board that this is not as good as it should be.
I think you're right. I think the I think it starts further down. I think the behaviour between members. I think we've sadly we've got to a point, and I've seen quite a lot of it. In county, it's creeping into district a little bit now, but the attitude between members isn't great. At times, it can be quite hostile. I think people, some individuals get too used to that behaviour, and then they don't even realise they're doing it towards to officers. Then, and I think that's the sad indictment of things. But so I think moves are being made to sort of correct behaviour between members. But if there's anything more that can be done there, it wouldn't be a bad thing, maybe.
This is a constant theme of mine, I'm afraid. I mean, one of our roles is to ensure high standards of conduct amongst members. So we're now hearing reports that that isn't always the case. So how are we going to fulfill that role in this set of circumstances? What messages can we be sending out as a committee to members of the combined authority? Do we need to be sending a letter or taking some other action to remind members of this need to conduct themselves in accordance with high standards? And I think there's absolutely no reason why members who are in political opposition to each other shouldn't conduct themselves in a proper manner. I mean, some of the conduct is quite ridiculous. So that's that point. I think the other point I just wanted to make, Chair, is in section 2.4 about the role of members. And members make recommendations and decisions. And there's no reference to that in these points. It's our main function. Well, it's a main function of elected members to recommend. We make recommendations here, but there's other members of the combined authority who actually make decisions, and it's the key it's a key role of members. Is it there? Like, no, okay.
I think Edwina might have something, and then Nick.
No, I was just going to say that's noted. It's not in there.
Thank you. The only point I was going to make, sorry, Mr. Mayor, if I may, absolutely, we can clarify it, but I think it's probably implicit in A in terms of the policymakers, and also to a degree implicit in H in terms of the roles relating to their position as members of the board, because of course it's a board rather than individual members who often make the decisions through that. But I absolutely take the point on board, and I think you're right, it needs clarification, and we will clarify that.
Now we've had this discussion, I don't. Sorry.
Forgive me, Chair. The point I was going to bring up, which was sort of the theme of the day for me, I think, is on training. Item 11 talks about member training, but only limits it to board members, and I wonder whether that needs altering to mean members of committees and so forth.
Thank you, Councillor Coles. We will amend that because the training that we're planning is for all members of the CA. We'll just clarify that includes all members of the combined authority.
How time critical is this?
It is up to this committee. There is an adopted protocol as it is. It would be good if we could go back to the next board with amendments. However, we can, if you want us to go back and think about wording and clarification, we can come back to the next committee and then take it to the next board.
This was done in a rush. wasn't it? When we introduced this, it was a necessary device. Looking at it and in the light of the conversation, if I was reading this as a person who's subject to this, it doesn't bring it to life. Because in the end, you can write all the rules, but what is the purpose of this? And I wonder whether we should ask it to be rethought, because it doesn't have the background that there's about the problem that the combined authority has had, the fact it's introduced civil, the fact that the audit committees. So I think it needs a human being written introduction, which isn't. This is not. But it's not legalese. It's just this is the problem we face, and this is a problem that both the officers and the members and the officers face, and it needs to be sorted. But there's none of this clarion call in there, and yet if presumably this is on some staff intranet somewhere, if I was trying to find this, we're not trying to get into the minds of the recipients, are we? And I wondered if there was support to ask to go back for a real think about the way this is presented as a communication and piece of significance, and come back to us. Do I have support for that? Okay. I said at the beginning there were 2 development sessions that haven't been earmarked, and given that behaviours are so fundamental to the mess we're in, I don't want that for the minutes, but you understand what I mean. Is this something we should devote some more time to, informally as well, because we're trying to help here?
Mr. Chair, if I could just perhaps suggest, I don't know any of the background. This is completely new to me. I don't know what it's talking about. I don't know anything about it whatsoever. And that's why I don't think it appropriate for me to talk about it at all. But on the point of the communication, I think you do have a choice now to say, because the report's written beautifully, as all the reports are, and we all recognize those reports and we know how to read through them. But maybe on some instances, it's worth thinking about writing a different kind of report, which is one of my things, actually. Sometimes you need to get, rather than the headline things that you have to get in, you need to know the emotional issues that you're actually trying to track, or the substantive or strategic issues that you're trying to track. And sometimes, although these accredited ways of writing things are designed to do that, and they ordinarily do it very well, maybe this is one of those times when you can say, no, we will write it in a rather different way, to communicate a rather different thing. Because I certainly haven't picked up any of this. I don't know. I have. It doesn't speak to me at all.
Yes, thank you. I think it's a really interesting discussion. I think actually it might be the difference between something that's needed as a sort of reference point for any issues that come through, as opposed to something that is very clearly communicatable, if that's the right word, to a wider audience, particularly internally as officers. And I'm wondering whether or not it's almost 2 separate documents. One is very similar to the one we presented today, which has those few changes in that have been recommended by the committee. And then sitting alongside it, there's something else that actually speaks to the heart and has more of those issues in that the chair's talked to, that you've talked to as well, that it is easier to communicate to people about what it's about. I mean, if my understanding of that is right, then I'm happy to take it on board for myself and Edwina to try and produce a second document ready for the September board that you can have a look at to see if that does effectively communicate this through, but probably having something similar to the existing document as a reference point, so that we've captured all the key areas in there. Would that work for the committee?
Okay, thank you, Nick. And I think you have a model really when we looked at the procurement policy earlier, because I don't think they should be separate. They need to be connected. And we had the policy and the guidance, and this is rather more guidance than purpose, direction of travel. How do we monitor it? Because we should be saying in there that we're complaints procedures and whistleblowing is all part of this. That it'll only work if people, as we talked at the very earliest about, you have to raise your hand when something is not in accordance with what we're trying to achieve as an authority. Yeah. Okay. I think that's really good.
I'm really sorry. I've just been rereading it. I'm finding board member all over the shop, so it's not just item 11. It might be that just the word board needs to be taken out for it to be compliant. Thank you.
It's a simplifying. I mean, the monitoring officer's there to make sure that it is legalistically correct, but we know that law is pretty dry stuff to read, and it's getting that the balance between the two. Okay. Do we want to say anything? I do not know how we feedback what happens at the audit committee in between meetings. Is this something we could ask you to report back, that we have discussed this and we're disappointed that progress still seems to be slow because there are instances of the breach of the protocol, and that we're taking a new look and a new approach at it, and we'll come back to the board. I don't think we should not give some feedback to the board.
If I may make a suggestion on that, Chair, if that's okay, is that if we are doing a two-pronged approach to have both this document and a separate document, it may be that, because I'm thinking about pace again here and trying to make sure that things are implemented as rapidly as possible, simply because obviously there are, as been highlighted, potential areas that we need to make sure that we have fully bottomed out. It might be worthwhile taking the changed report with the issues have been raised today about board and the other detailed areas, to the board on the 26th of July with a covering report that identifies two things. One is the strong feelings of this committee in relation to the areas that have been raised. And the second is to identify that there will be a further document that follows it once this committee has had a chance to review it, that will be the wider piece to place the member officer protocol in context and to be more communicable to the wider organisation. That may be a mechanism that can get those messages across, Chair. I'm not sure if there's naturally another mechanism that would enable us to be able to do that at pace and to get something in place for the 26th of July. Would that seem like a solution?
I mean, I'm convey our concerns about the fact that there are still breaches of this code, that this is a work in progress, but meanwhile here is an amended version pending something which makes the combined authorities' purpose and the seriousness of proper behaviours explained in a way which is more understandable to all the players. And remind them, could we, that the reason that we're having the improvement plan, this is one of the key areas that kicked off the concerns about the governance and effectiveness of the combined authority. There's a lot. I wasn't trying to draft it then. I just wanted to. Perhaps you could let me have a look.
Absolutely.
Then you've got it. Not. I don't need to see the document again, but the way you're going to sell it to the board. Simon.
Thank you. I mean, this is a very productive conversation you're leading here, Chair, and I commend you for it and sort of elevating this process. So an institution is defined by behavioural norms, and the way in which those norms are adopted and enforced. And so we have to have an enforcement element around this as well, just to make sure that when people do step out of line, the norms are set out in this protocol, that they're actually brought to book. There has to be an enforcement element to all of this that's effective and works. It can be soft, and it's a collective responsibility of all of us to engage in that. But as you say, this was a flashpoint, caused a problem for this organisation, and it really does need to be tackled once and for all.
Well, thank you for the support of all and the reaction of Nick. And I think, do we yet feel that the combined authority is really committed to what this is all about in regard to behaviours? I don't feel it yet. We can see the beginnings, but it's drumming that message home if there's still these behaviours that are being observed. Anyway, I think we've reached a position where we're all of a mind. We're given a lot more, but it is fundamental. Yep.
Just to pick up your comment, whether or not the combined authority is committed, I think officers generally are committed. It may be, as Steve says, some members are not yet fully committed. And the issues that Edwina talked about earlier have been officer member issues where often it's the members who've been acting inappropriately rather than the officers, is the impression we get. But I think you're right from the conclusions that we've come to.
I sort of slightly veered from putting the tail on the donkey like that. But maybe next time we might need to. Okay. Thank you. I hadn't expected to get there, but that's good. Right, now we move on to item 11, which is, we're breaking new ground here, because whilst for 3 years, I think, or 4 years, the combined authority has encouraged us to, and the overview and scrutiny, to co-opt an independent councillor from who is not from a political party. This was the first year that we accepted that idea, but then there's no process. And this paper has been put together to offer a process to see if we're comfortable with the process and what it's about. And we have to technically get agreement to get on with it through the board. My personal view as the chair is we need somebody by the September board, otherwise half the year's gone. But having put that context, I'll leave Edwina to take down the road.
Thank you, Chair. I think you've introduced the report beautifully. I think the only thing I just wanted to say is, as you have mentioned, it'd be very good to have someone in place by the next Audit and Governance Committee meeting in September. Appendix 1 sets out the process, well, the suggested process that could be taken to recruit to this role. I think the only thing I wanted to point out is that there would need to be a meeting of the Audit and Governance to select the candidates. But if you remember, at the last committee meeting, you did approve subcommittees. So just to bring to your mind and for you to sort of have a think whether, rather than have the whole of the ANG meet, you'd be happy for a subcommittee to meet, and then that speeds the process along. That's the only thing I would want to mention. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Edwina. I've got some personal views about this, but let's have the conversation and then we'll see if we're in roughly the same place.
Well, all my views are personal, so I'll pass it away anyway. The process in the appendix, personally, I think the quicker we present this to the Combined Authority Board for agreement, the better. And so I would put that at least second, probably not first. For something to come back to Audit and Governance Committee for review and approval, I forget what when our next meeting is, but I think that's not until September. So that would be. I agree with John that be too late. And I still think sometimes we muddle between a co-opted councillor and a co-opted independent person. So in the recommendation in C, let's just keep this to a co-opting an independent councillor from a constituent council, and then delete anything about referring subsequently to an independent person who might be an expert in X, Y, or Z. Because we already have one of those in JP, and hopefully we can agree an extension either to him or appointment of a new chair at some stage. So I would keep that completely separate.
Graham somewhat stole my thunder out a little bit, but I think I'd take it a step further as well. And I don't know if this would make the process easier, because it would certainly reduce the numbers down, or the pool to choose from, I should say, maybe. But if it's an independent councillor that's not aligned with a coalition, I'm sure that I know there are still independent councillors about that are truly independent as opposed to being whipped by a group. I don't know if that would be an aid somewhat to reduce the pool, so to speak. I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of points. I think I appreciate what Councillor Wilson's saying about the difference between independent member and independent councillor, but I'm of the view that that needs to stay because that's part of the constitution of the other regulatory committee, that we keep an independent member for specific purpose, short-term, non-voting, to deliver a particular thing. So I think it has relevance to be written in a way that's probably a bit clearer between independent councillor and not. My issue, though, however, is on page 283, which is selection of candidates to be determined by process approved by Audit and Governance. And that process is one that's going to be a challenge, I think, for us, because we're going to have to come up with a person spec. We're going to have to poll all the independent councillors. We're going to have to work out of those whom we would like to turn up for a presentation of their skills or an interview or whatever. We're going to have to constitute an interview board. We're going to have to make sure that that's going to be politically non-biased, I would have thought, to make sure that it's relevant. Individuals there will have to have had fair recruitment training so that they can actually deliver that fairly. It gets terribly complicated. So I'm just wondering whether it's achievable by September.
We did have, when we were in the pre-brief, we had some trickiness in trying to find a way forward. And I'm at the keep it simple, but I don't know enough. So can I just ask for my education, when you become a member of this committee, what process have you gone through? Have you gone through any of these processes? You just get. So why should an independent councillor be any different? We want willing horses, don't we?
We do want winning horses, but here they could come from any constituent group, whereas for us, we've been nominated by a particular local authority in accordance with the political balance proportionality issues.
Right, that bit I do understand.
But for an independent person, an independent councillor, I agree with Steve's comments. There are groups of independents that are whipped, and we need to have a view as to whether or not that counts as a party or not.
And I wasn't aware of that. I haven't got to the top of the hill yet. Shall I totally gobsmack you and then we have the conversation? I think we should just ask for names and then we should put the names in a hat. One does it because how do you choose otherwise? Because it's not the goodness or badness, they're independents.
I mean,
It's provocative.
The notion that a person who's standing as an independent councillor is independent is risible. I mean, it's ridiculous. There's no such thing. They have political views, and I can't see why they're being privileged in this way so much. I mean, as Steve has quite rightly said, to my knowledge, all independents are part of a political alliance, one way or another. On the city council, we have one independent, and she is part of the Green Group for purposes of getting on places on committees and so on and so forth. So the notion is flawed. The pool of independent councillors is very, very small across the piece, as far as I understand. And here it says at 3.2, the co-opted independent member will be expected to provide advice and bring valuable experience and knowledge to the committee in discharging its function. Well, when you're fishing in such a tiny pool, how are we actually being able to find people with relevant experience and knowledge that they bring to this committee? I think the notion is completely flawed.
Well, you weren't here. It was 36 seconds on the nod. We agreed this, as opposed to 36 seconds on the nod we did agree, which was all happened in the previous years. I don't think we need this person spec because we don't have person specs for you guys. Well, and we're all guys, the front runners, Karen, but I didn't mean that in any improper way. So I don't understand. I mean, I'm not sufficiently familiar with all the machinations of why people are independent. When we did have the first year, we had an independent councillor who was a member of this committee, and that came out of whatever knitting goes on political balance. And he just appeared, and he was just a member of the committee. But this is not that, because the independents don't get one on political balance, as I understand it, Caroline.
Yes, thank you, Chair. A point of clarification for me, really, because there are no. The councillor is quite right. What did you want this person for? And how did it come across that you wanted it? Do you want an independent person who's going to think independently, which would be brilliant?
No. Can I just go? This is the Combined Authority Board.
Yeah.
Puts this out each year.
Yeah.
Because there's no way in the political balancing that an independent gets onto these committees. So as to try and finesse it, this is my simple layman's understanding of it. This was an offer that if you committees would like extra input from a non-political party person, why don't you co-opt? And every year until this year, that's been robustly and quickly dismissed by this committees. Nick is going to tell me how it really operates.
So you could get them from parish councils, maybe, but I doubt very much whether you could get an independent council. Sorry.
If I may just a moment, because I'm aware that some members of the committee weren't here at the last meeting. The chair is absolutely right that every year the Combined Authority Board asks both Audit and Governance and Overview and Scrutiny whether they would like to co-opt independent members. This year, I mean, colleagues will know who are on, members will know who are on Overview and Scrutiny, that they declined that offer. The Audit and Governance Committee at its last meeting accepted that offer of co-opting an independent councillor onto this committee for the duration of this municipal year. So that decision having been taken, this report is about the process to use to identify that individual. Just to come back to the point that have been raised in relation to to how you might constrain what is an independent. I think that the issues at the time were that the proportionality regulations surrounding this committee relate only to people who are members of registered political parties. So therefore, an independent would be anybody who is not a member of a registered political party, whichever authority they came from. And that would create the pool of potential members to come from across a wide spectrum of all the constituent councils. So then the question is, what process might be used to rapidly select an individual? The Combined Authority Board needs to agree what the process is as part of the Constitution, so we need to take a proposed process to the Combined Authority Board on the 26th of July. It could be as complex as is laid out in the report. I think that's one end of the spectrum. I think that would be right, absolutely, if it was an independent member from outside a local authority that we wanted. I think possibly for an independent co-opted member, there could be only one or two questions you would ask in terms of if you've got any previous experience around an audit and governance committee and working on one of those. And that may reduce the field down to a limited number, at which stage I'm not sure how you would then interview those individuals and what context you'd interview them on. Or would you just literally go by a selection process once you've reduced that to a manageable number of a random selection effectively from there? I think there are pros and cons for both, but I would agree with, I think, what I've heard from the majority of the members, that having a faster and easier process is probably more valuable than having one that goes through a lot of process simply to try and find someone who may not be on for very long if it goes much beyond September. Is that helpful?
That does, Nick. And we've got to cut this Gordian knot. And you've given me an idea. And I would make the proposal that we go out to all councillors who are not members of a registered political party, saying here is an opportunity to be co-opted. They're the terms of reference. Volunteers who have audit committee background, that will reduce the pool, should put their names forward, and there'll be a ballot. Do we care if we don't get one? So let's keep it, and because you're not selected on any of the criteria that are in here, why should this person, even by saying they've been on an audit committee? No, don't let's even say that. Just say this is the opportunity. Do you want to do it? And we'll have a ballot. And we'll do that by the umpty up. The first meeting I was umpty up, and if nobody comes up, do we care? No, a ballot, as in, sorry, as a, yeah. No, isn't that a ballot? Okay, lucky Dick. Because if we don't have it simple, we'll never get there.
If I may, Chair, we need two, because we need a substitute as well. In the paperwork, we require two, because a substitute is also listed in the paperwork.
Chair, I mean, this is farce. I think your point was...
You can't rewrite history. If you don't come to the meeting, you don't know the decisions.
Well, let's just see how this... We're talking about a very small pool of people. In my experience, getting people to come onto this committee...
You propose that we... Why don't you propose that we reverse the decision we made last month and see if there's a majority to accept?
Okay, I propose that we reverse the decision that was made at the last committee. I don't know.
Okay, I'm told it's helpful legal advice for once. We can't do that because we can't go backwards. That's not what Rena said, but that's what she meant. Okay, within a year. So that's what I propose. We just go out with the terms of reference to all of the ones who aren't registered to a party, say, there's this opportunity. It starts on the 20th, umpty up. If you'd like to do it, put your name forward, and we'll have not names out of a hat, but a ballot, whatever the right phrase is. And we'd like to get you approve that CA board on the 26th of July and get on with it.
Chair, can I suggest that you include parish councils?
No. You've got to, they're not constituent authorities.
Well, you won't. Okay.
No, and
That's just to increase the number of.
no, I understand. But well, I'll just get more legal advice. So we're pioneering here, and that's what we're going to do. All right. Good. Do we have a unanimity with this? All right. Okay. Good. We won't have a vote, and then I can reverse it next time because we never vote. No, we agree. All right. Good. Thank you. And if they don't like it, then they can come up with their own. But there is no. I mean, we do need this. I don't know how you do it for every scrutiny, but that's not my problem. This is pioneering stuff. Let's find out how it goes. We didn't know it was pioneering when Simon wasn't in the room. We managed to get away with it. Okay. I think that gets us to the end now. We've got the work program report. Are there any comments on the work program? And we've discussed development sessions. Something on substage on behaviours, something on accounts, and do that. Are we happy? All right. Thank you very much. The next. No, we're not dealing. We've dealt with item 14. We're not going to discuss it.
Oh, just now.
If you wanted to briefly give. Who?